Well, hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation in our 2022 COVI lecture series. My name is Doug Hunt, and I'll be your moderator today. Our lecture will run about 45 minutes today, and then we'll have a question and answer period following that. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat feature at any time, and they will be shared at the end. I'm very pleased to welcome COVI fellow Ronald Jackson as our speaker today. Ron received his PhD from the University of Toronto in plant pathology. He was a professor and chair of the botany department at Brandon University in Manitoba, acted as a technical advisor to the Manitoba Liquor Control Commission, and developed sensory tests to assess the tasting skills of members of its sensory board. He's the author of several textbooks and reviews, notably Wine Science Principles and Application and Wine Tasting, a Professional Handbook. He's currently allied with COVI as a fellow. So with that, Ron, I'll ask you to please go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. This is the first time I've ever done anything via the internet, so if it is not as smooth as I would like, please apologize. I apologize right at the beginning, but I'll try and do as good a presentation in this new mode for me. I'm an old dog trying to learn new tricks. Okay, the talk is on food and wine pairing. Is it a myth or reality? It is basically a myth. That is, if one takes that concept that there is a perfect synergy between a particular wine and a particular food that is universal. Even the concept of this is comparatively modern. And the idea that there is some mythical, wonderful combination of the wine with a particular food that is universal is, in fact, a myth. Okay, why would I say this? It's basically because of what I read in the literature and personal experience. Okay, let's look at what are some of the reasons why a universal marriage is essentially impossible. We have personal factors. Let's look at the genetics of sensory evaluation. There are 7 gustatory taste receptors on our tongue and in the mouth, of which, as far as bitter, there are 40 of them. So that's about 47 types of receptors in the mouth. Then you have about 7 trigeminal ones that are astringency and heat and so on. And in the nose, there are about 400 olfactory receptors. So we have a lot of variability potentially in there because each of these receptors can have allelic variants. And some people simply have receptors that are non-functional. So in a sense, every individual is almost a sensory island of their own nature. And so people are really unique. And so the synergy between a wine and a food, it may be perfect for one person, but be uninspiring for another. Then we have the aspects of our personal upbringing and our cultural heritage, which influences how we're going to initially respond to a particular wine with particular food. And of course, then we also have that wonderful phenomenon called context, the environmental conditions under which you're tasting it. Are you happy, sad? Are you on vacation in a wonderful environment? Or are you just exhausted from coming back from work? This is all going to influence how you react to any particular food and wine combination. There's essentially only one real guiding principle to flavor combination, but that is assuming that you accept the European culinary tradition, which is essentially enhances the concept of flavor equivalency, so that whatever the wine is in flavor intensity should be somewhat similar to the flavor intensity of the food. Where did this association of wine and food even evolve? Of course, obviously it's in Europe. And what did it evolve, or how did it evolve? When France, Italy, Spain, and other European regions, the grapevine was indigenous, and it was comparatively easy to grow. Wine was comparatively easy to produce, maybe not the best quality, but easy to produce, and certainly safer than most water supplies. So therefore, it was preferred, either wine or beer, to drinking water, because most water supplies were not, as we would say, potable, safe to drink. Typically, wine was taken without fanfare, often in tumblers. That was all they had. Only on special occasions was wine taken with much thought. And in Germany, most wines were taken as a sipping wine. So let's look at the preconditions for any rational pairing of wine and food. First, you need a wide selection of wines. Without a wide selection of wines, how can you pick, quote, the right wine? Food courses, if you have a whole sequence of them, food should come in a particular sequence, so you can pair a particular wine with a particular food. You need the availability of glasses of an appropriate shape that can allow you to actually assess the quality of the wine during the meal. You actually have to have a concept of what you want when you're pairing. If you don't have that, you wouldn't even contemplate pairing. Then you need that intimate knowledge of the flavors of both foods and wines. Most people don't have that. But let's just look. When in time would this possibility of pairing wines even have started? You need that wide selection of wine. When did this actually become comparatively easily available? Basically, you're looking at 1750. Why? Most wines at the time were consumed locally, in which case you only have a few types of wine. If you're going to have a wide range, the wine had to be transported largely by water. If it was by road, it was far more expensive. The road system was poor. The transport was by basically a cart with wooden wheels, with no shock absorbers. The wine was transported in barrels. So just contemplate, kind of in the Western movie, you have a barrel of wine. You've got it in your covered wagon, and you're rumbling across the plains, hitting potholes and everything else. That's going to disrupt the connections of the staves in the barrel. Oxygen will get in, favor spoilage. Basically, the only way to safely transport wine in barrel was by water, and you didn't want to move it very far overland. How about how long did wine survive in the old days? Most of it went vinegary by summer after production. There was no control of oxidation. You didn't have sulfur dioxide. You didn't have sulfur dioxide for antimicrobial control. In many areas, if the fermentation heated up, you'd have premature termination of fermentation. That would mean you'd have a residual amount of sugar favoring spoilage. In most cases, wine didn't last very long in the old days. Most wines would be made essentially the same way as red wines. You just leave it on the seeds and skins for a long time. So any subtle aspects of most white wines that we currently think is appropriate essentially didn't exist early on. So we have that. When did foods start to be presented in a sequence? Okay, basically it's about 1810 after that. So before that, what was it like? If you were really wealthy, one of those elite, food tended to be served in several courses. And so all the food would be presented out on a table. Sweet, savory, you name it, everything out at the same time. Foods in the old time was very highly spiced. It's almost like going into a buffet and saying, oh, what wine is going to pair with everything? Well, basically, it won't. What about the majority of the people, the serfs, the poor, the people like my ancestors? Well, what did they live on? Gruel, stockpot. They had no time, basically didn't have any funds for anything fancy. So the elite may have had the possibility, but the way the food was presented was ill-designed for having any pairing of a particular wine with particular food. Well, we in the West would consider refined cuisine develop? Basically, it was in Renaissance Italy. And it moved to France with Catherine de' Medici when she married King Henry II about 1547. And that was the origin of what we now consider French cuisine, was actually from Italy. And prior to Italy, it actually came from the Middle East. If everything was all together all at once, it changed to a sequence of normally soup first, then fish, then poultry, then meat, then the salad, then dessert dishes. This became the rage about 1810 and spread worldwide. So this is when you can really start to think about pairing with a particular wine with particular food. Then we look at the glasses. Oh, well, when did you have glasses that were really optimal for comparing? And amazingly, this is about 1950. Clear crystal, when did it first become industrially produced? That was by Ravenscroft, 1650. Initially, the glasses were of small volume, about 50 mils, V-shape. How can you swirl that glass if it's only 50 mils right up at the top? That means maybe you have 25 mils in a glass. Boy. And then you have the habit of how wine was served at fancy meals. Did you have the bottle on the table? Did you have your glasses on the table? No. Servants brought you a sample in these small glasses. You would sample it, and you would hand the glass back to your servant. And if you wanted more, he would pour it, bring it to you. Seems pretty strange, but that seems to be the way it was. So let's look at the size of glasses over the years. 1700. Boy, this is almost a shot glass. And it stays small. Stays small. 1780, 1820 is still small. A little bit bigger, but maybe up to 100 mils max that you could get in the glass. And then you go on, stays low, still about 100 mils, 100 mils. That means you can probably have 50 mils in the glass. And it's only about 1970 when glass volume starts to go up it goes. So until we get now, and you get these big balloon glasses. What did the glasses actually look like? Here are some examples. How are you going to swirl wine at a glass like that? I had 19th century glasses, V-shape, pour for. No, nobody wants this type anymore. Most people would say, hey, that's a shot glass. Even early 20th century, this is the shape of glass. Oh boy, not ideal. Okay, let's look at the interest and rationale for food and wine pairing. All the elements for possibility, 1950s. This did coincide, end of the Second World War, increased interest in fine dining, primarily because people were traveling more. You had more affluence. You had more leisure time. Hey, nice time to actually enjoy life, finally. Let's look at the first cooking TV shows that are now the rage, just loads of them. But the first one, 1963, Julia Child. And she came out with her Mastering the Art of French Cooking. 1961, Pamela Price. First book on looking at food and wine comparison, 1975. Wineries start to promote food and wine pairing, possibly as an antidote to the 1980s neo-prohibitionist movement. Then we have about this time, then you start to get the publication of all these food and wine magazines and books that are all over the place nowadays. Okay, here's the book, Guide de Vin, 1967, The 10 Commandments of Wine and Food. He was the Moses of wine. Okay, so some of what he says makes sense, but most of it is like 10 Commandments: must do this, must not do that, must be served, must be served, must be served, must be served. Oh, that boy, who wants anybody telling you you must do this, you must not do that, as though you don't have any independent views on what you would like. Must be paired with its own wine. Oh, more. But then some of what he says, to me, I cannot understand. Wine must be served in their best season, whatever that is, not only from a climatic point of view, but also from an evolutionary one. What's he talking about? Maybe you do, but I don't. Then he says, advisable to separate each wine with a sip of water. Well, the current literature would say that water is a poor palate cleanser, probably the worst palate cleanser. But here he is saying water. And then he says, never serve one big wine on important occasions. That means you're supposed to have a whole series of them. Is that really what you want, a whole series of wines? That could lead to excessive consumption. Okay, let's look. Now, food and wine pairing, the concept of doing so is not new. Romoli, 1570, in his encyclopedic work suggests of pairing food and wine. Okay, yeah. This fellow in Germany, he also says at a banquet, pair particular wines, particular food. But how you do that, the way they lived back then. And then in 1800s, this lady in her Philadelphia cookbook gave some suggestions. And some of them are a bit, I would say, and most people would say, very strange. With oysters, take Sauternes and Barsac. Okay, they'll be sweet. Grave, dry. Chablis, dry. Well, a sweet wine or a dry wine with oysters? Both? Okay, fish, Rhine wines. Okay, mentioning some famous places for sure. But then Liefra milk? Having Liefra milk with fish? I don't know. But, and then entrees, okay, a range. But with an entree, you have an iced punch and sherbet. Strange. Roast, okay. Pommard, Corton, Chambertin, Romani Conti. Now you'd have to be very, very wealthy to have a range of those. Cold roast. Now here's a weird one. Vin de Paille, which is a sweet wine. Why would you have a sweet wine with cold roast? And hot dessert. You're going to have Chateau Margaux with a hot dessert. I don't know about you, but that seems pretty weird to me. Okay, port maybe, but red champagne. And, I know where she came up with some of these ideas. The dessert, you're going to have Vouvray. And okay, maybe whole series of sparkling champagnes with dessert. Well, I don't know. Of course, champagne back then tended to be a lot sweeter than it is now. So we have to think of what were champagnes like back in the 1850s and 1800s. They were, the dry ones are, okay, maybe 150 years old, 100. But sweeter champagnes were much more common back there. So it just seems very strange from a modern concept. Are you supposed to understand this? No, the detail too small. But the concept that this fellow writes was trying to get across the end of the book in 1961 was that if you're preparing a menu, this is basically for chefs, and you had various concepts. So he has various animal foods, and he rates them in flavor intensity. And vegetable material, various types of beverages. Wine is down in this area, with white wines down here, and rosé, red wines, and so on. Then you have accessory foods, all on this flavor scale. And what these curves are, that if you wanted to prepare a menu with decreasing flavor intensity, and you wanted decreasing flavor intensity, well, what animal food would you compare with the vegetable when it's last, and the carrier that is last? Or do you want the flavor throughout the course of the meal to go up? So his idea was for chefs, if they wanted to prepare meals, you could either have throughout the meal, the flavor intensity would be the same, increase or decrease depending on how your concept. The book itself, this particular chart was on a fold out. So it was about 4 times the size of the page of the book. just so you could actually read the details. But this was an interesting concept, that this pairing food and wine based on flavor intensity. Interesting concept, but without most people, do they have sufficient knowledge of food flavors and wine flavors to really do this? And in his chart, wine was all in one area, red wines, rosés, so on. But there's a great deal of flavor variation between Rieslings, depending on where it is produced, how it's produced. There's also a problem with the food, because if you broil it or baste it in a broth, all these things are going to influence the flavor intensity of the food. And you really need to have a great deal of knowledge if you're really going to compare and pair up foods and wines. And then how about the typical food flavors if you're trying to pair up the flavor characteristics of food and wine? What similarity is there? Okay, typical food flavors tend to be savory, meat and fish. What are the typical flavors of wine? Fruity floral. They don't have any meaty, savory flavors. Typical foods, you have vegetable characteristics. Wines, maybe herbal, oaky. As far as pH, foods tend to be neutral. Wines tend to be acidic or sweet. Foods, you add salt or spices. Wine flavors, they're not salty. Occasionally there's some peppery character from phenolics or rotenone, but not typical. Again, there's poor comparison. How about bitterness in typical foods? Basically non-existent. Wines have bitterness, especially reds. Are foods astringent? No. Wines, certainly, quite often they're dry, dusty in the mouth, certainly reds. Typical foods, non-alcoholic, wine alcoholic, food, non-fizzy, possibly fizzy if you're having sparkling wine. Foods typically warm and hot in comparison to food or wine, which is cool and lukewarm. What experimental evidence do we have? Okay, generally, people think about food, and if you're having a wine tasting, you have cheese with wine. Why? Okay, people tend to think, oh, well, it's going to make the wine taste better and the cheese taste better and so on. Well, how does it actually work? It acts by diminishing the flavor, the retronasal and gustatory attributes of the wine. And wine diminishes the sensory aspects of the cheese. Essentially, what you've got are two negatives being perceived sensorially as a positive. Of the ones that have been tested, cheddar and Gruyere cheeses seem to be most appropriate, and not too surprisingly, red wines seem to be best paired with flavorful, drier cheeses, white wine with moister, mild cheeses. And let's look at an example. Here we have two blue cheeses. One is a Roquefort, well, one is a Danish blue, and compared with 5 wines. Admittedly, this is somewhat small, but this is citrus flavor of wine. This is, I forget what, fruity flavors. This one is black currant. This is mineral flavor. This one is sweetness. what do you see happening? The black bars are the wine taken by itself. There's the Chablis, there's a whole series of white wines. And all of them you see flavor, citrus flavor down, 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 down with the blue cheeses. And with fruity flavors, it goes down. Black currant flavor. Some is higher in this particular Chilean wine, but it goes down with the cheese, down again. Reduce flavor, reduce, reduce, reduce. The only thing which is variable is the bottom line, depending on particular wine. Sometimes the sweetness goes up with the blue cheeses. Sometimes it doesn't. So it's highly variable, but seems that most times the benefit of having wine with cheese is that the combination, the cheese suppresses some of the more unpleasant aspects of the wine and vice versa. It certainly suppresses flavor, which is kind of odd to think that this is a good idea. The same appears to happen with a meal. What happens with proteins in the meal? They complex with the tannins. So it's less bitter, less astringent. Neutralizes some of the acidity of the wine, so it's less sour, if you want to say that. It binds aromatic compounds. Undesirable because that means you don't detect them as much. However, food does dilute wine constituents, notably its alcohol content. This favors the release of esters. These are pleasant, fruity, sort of smelling compounds. Wine food acts as a mouthwash. It cleanses the palate so that the food that you take is going to appear fresh, and the food will mouthwash the mouth again, allowing the wine to be sensed afresh. Wine can act as a condiment. White wine can undesirably accentuate the fishy perception of some foods, so that there is a bad combination. And here's some data on that. The effect of ferrous iron in model wine. Wines do contain some iron, depending on which one, but this was a model wine. What did increasing the iron content of the wine do to the fishy aftertaste? Increased it. Obviously an undesirable thing. That would be a bad comparison, pairing. Let's look at, well, one of the real benefits of having food with wine, or wine with food. It slows the alcohol content getting into the blood and corresponding the blood alcohol content. Here we have fasting, that's A. So a certain amount of wine taken all at once and quickly goes up. Yeah, you get a peak around an hour and a half after, then it tapers off. C is fasting, but with 6 doses. So separating the doses by 5 minutes basically doesn't make any difference. And then what happens if you take it with a meal? During the meal in 3 doses, is this one, and taking the same amount of wine in 6 doses over the meal. So obviously the peak alcohol content getting in the blood is reduced when you take it with food, and spreading it over the whole meal is even better in reducing the maximum amount of alcohol getting in the blood, and it actually slows when it gets in. And another graphic. Here's taking wine as a single dose after fasting, and E is 6 hours after the meal, obviously the worst. D, 4 hours after a meal. Okay, the meal has reduced it somewhat. B is during the meal. And C, surprisingly, 2 hours taking the wine after the meal. But again, reduced amount getting into the blood and slows it. So the total amount of alcohol ever getting into the blood is reduced. What about the meal type? Okay, and this is if they actually inject the wine intravenously. Okay, obviously it goes up very fast. This is when you just drink it. Okay, obviously it slows it, and these three are with a fat meal, a carbohydrate meal, or a protein meal. The type of food that you're actually consuming really doesn't make a heck of a lot of difference. If we look at gender, sorry ladies, we find that alcohol gets into the blood and stays higher in female. Okay, this is based on same mass of a person, so both weigh exactly the same amount. So the woman will actually get a higher alcohol content from exactly the same amount in comparison to a male. Why is this so? It happens to be that the majority of males have a higher proportional muscle mass than do women. Women have comparatively, compared to men, a higher proportion of fatty tissue. What difference does this make? It means muscle tissue will absorb alcohol out of the blood. Fatty tissue does not. So for the same mass, if you have a higher proportion of relative of fatty tissue, then more alcohol will remain in the blood. Just simply isn't absorbed into the fatty tissue, so remains in the blood. Effect of the carbon dioxide content. So we have a champagne and the alcohol content. And if you take it, the same wine, but with all the carbon dioxide removed, yes, the carbon dioxide does result in alcohol getting into the blood faster. Not a great deal, but still it does. But over time, the influence peters out. Okay. With all this potential complexity of individual genetics and type of food and trying to figure out what to pair with what, well, what can one really say? Well, some things obviously are abomination. I know from experience. I went to a house once with a Riesling Auslese, and he served it with bouillabaisse. Oh, abomination. A dry Chablis with rhubarb pie. Oh, most people would say no, 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 no. Any wine with a salad with vinaigrette, vinegar with wine. No, 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 no. In most Western cuisine, what you're trying to do is pair components of the meal that are of a similar flavor intensity. And so you add salt, spices, sauces, condiments, and so on, trying to get some harmonious balance there. At least in Western concept. So in that regard, red with red and wine with wine, that whole acronym is has some rationality. Red meats tend to be more compatible with the flavor intensity of red wines. Red meats tend to have more flavor. Red wines also more flavor. And then there's also the color compatibility. The dark color of a red wine with red meats seems to be more compatible, as we say. Conversely, white wines show more flavor and color characteristics with poultry and fish. So that seems to make sense. But some people don't agree with that, obviously. What are other concerns? Well, really, there are a lot of concerns if you're going to compare food with wine, other than just the characteristics of the food and wine. You have the preferences of the guests. You want to honor them. This is the social aspect of a meal. That is as important as anything else. And of course, if you want to impress, that's another thing to take into consideration when you're pairing a wine with a food. But normally, the Western cuisine, you say flavor intensity should increase throughout the meal. White wine normally before red, simply because it fits in with this flavor intensity increase. Young wines before more mature. This is a bit of contrast with that. The thing is that more mature wines, especially old ones, tend to be very subtle. And so to really appreciate the subtlety of some of these old wines, you don't want to have it with a meal, because the meal intensity of its flavor will cover up the subtlety of that wonderfully mature old wine. So there, we have that. Usually the finer the wine, the simpler the meal, with minimal flavor. And most times that simply means you have a bit of chicken with your very, very fine wine. Number of wines. Okay, we have always the problem of concern about alcohol and driving. There are some comments that are in the popular literature for which there is no experimental basis. Often it says that wine acids cut fats, whatever that means, presumably reduces. There's no rational reason why that would happen. Wine acids are water soluble. Fats are not soluble in water. So how is it going to cut? They don't mix. Saltiness of cheese contrasts with the sweetness of dessert wines. Well, what do you mean contrast? Nobody defines what that means. And I've never detected that personally. What do we have some experimental evidence for? Catagens increase the size of lipid droplets, causing them to cream. Okay, that's true. Then we have evidence for that. Oil suppresses the bitterness and astringency of tannins. Presumably why that happens is that oil covers some of the taste receptors of the tongue, where you have bitterness, and maybe on the sides of the mouth where you're detecting astringency. So that these bitter and astringent compounds can't even access the receptors. Salt reduces the perception of bitterness, enhances flavor perception. Okay, a little data again. Here we have a soup, and the open circles, that its comparative thickness, and these various aspects of flavor of the soup, and the outer one with the black circles, this is with salt. So we have, obviously the saltiness of the soup is going to go up if you add it, but the perception of thickness was increased. The perception of fullness of the soup was increased. Aroma intensity would not change. Overall flavor strength was enhanced. Overall balance was enhanced. What was reduced was the bitter component. Sweetness was marginally increased. So salt has a major influence. This other one with the open triangle, that was potassium glutamate, the umami aspect, really didn't have a lot of influence, but then accent is sodium glutamate, not potassium glutamate. Potassium glutamate has less umami aspect than does sodium glutamate. Okay. Influence on flavor improvement, or change anyways. Wine activates the production of saliva. Wine acids, notably succinic and malic acid, activate the release of gastrin and gastric juices in the stomach. So digestion is better. Marinating meat in red wine reduces the production of mutagenic and carcinogenic heterocyclic amines produced during meat searing. So if you're going to sear meat, marinate it is a good idea. Tannins are metabolized in the colon. They produce antioxidants. They're circulated in the blood, and of course, antioxidants in wine are one of its health benefits. The higher content of tannins in red wine, they bind the higher metal content in red meat. By binding the metal ions, it limits the production of toxic oxygen radicals and lipid oxidation products in the stomach. It also has a positive influence in increasing the circulating LDLs, the so-called good lipoproteins. We have all these influences beyond flavor. The lower content of sulfur dioxide in red wines and mature white wine, the sulfur dioxide does actually pass out through the cork. It avoids sulfide-induced destruction of vitamin B1 in the food. Tannins inactivate enzymes in the intestinal tract. They also favor the not so good, but okay. They have bacteriostatic and bactericidal influence in the stomach and the small intestine. Wine delays the opening of the sphincter of the small intestinal tract. And most of the alcohol from wine is taken up through the small intestine. So if you slow it getting into the small intestine, that slows the rate at which the alcohol will be taken up from the intestinal tract. And of course, where does it go first? It goes into the liver, where most of the alcohol is metabolized to acetic acids, and initially acetic acid, then respired. So simply slowing the rate at which alcohol gets into the intestinal tract means your liver has more time to break down alcohol into other products which can be consumed in the Krebs cycle. So definite advantage. So, okay, how about when you add wine during the preparation, if you have a flambe, and how much alcohol is left after your flambe? Most people would be surprised. 75% is left. If you marinate it and take it out of the wine, how much is left? 70%. Simmering, 45% left. 30 minutes simmering, 35%. Hour of simmering, 25%. Simmer for 2 hours, okay, there's 10% alcohol remaining. I was surprised at this, meaning that when you add alcohol to your food and you're trying to calculate, well, how much alcohol am I actually taking into my system during this, you actually have to incorporate how much alcohol you add in the preparation. What are the origin of some of our preferences and aversions? Some of it is hardwired as far as taste, such as bitterness and acidity. Most people don't like that. We don't like putrid odors. We don't like pungent odors. That is hardwired. Then we have all the allelic genetic differences that make each person somewhat different. And we have our experience. When does this influence how we respond? What the mother consumes when we're in the womb actually influences how the child will respond to food. If the mother liked it and ate it, probably the child will like it. If the mother didn't have it, it's more a moot point whether the child will like it. Certainly, if you have illness, when you sample something, you'll probably have a permanent negative response, especially if it's the first time you've had it. Cultural influences, peer pressure, that's certainly going to change things. As with me, the context of the meal, your emotional state. I mentioned there's a lot of variability from people. Well, this is with rotenone in red wine. And the threshold level, look at the variation. Here we have 25% of all the tasters couldn't even detect it at 4,000 nanograms. And here, the small proportion, about 2.5%, could have 0.4 nanograms. You could have multiple of these representative graphs showing the huge variation in people in how they respond to flavors and tastes and smells and so on. Take-home story, much of the pleasure of actually contemplating pairing a wine with a food is in its anticipation. Just sitting around saying, oh, gee, well, what am I going to have with this meal? It can be lots of fun. And most of the time, it won't be a disaster. You can have bad luck, but most of the time it won't be. The more refined the age of the wine, basically, the simpler the food you want to have. If you really like a specific wine and you really like a recipe, and probably if you like both, unless you're inordinately unlucky, the pairing is going to be 5. It may not be transcendental, this wonderful thing. You thank God that you're still alive to have it, but it won't be a disaster most of the time. The context obviously is going to either improve or decrease the perception. How about the price and prestige of a wine? Almost everybody would say, who knows a lot about wine, it's a poor indicator of the quality. Young wines tend to be more flavorful and varietally distinctive. That's true. Basically follow the KISS principle, keep it simple. Stupid. Also, basically a meal without wine is called breakfast. And how about a nice ambiance, good context? If you're ever in London, I don't own this place. I don't have any money in it, but I've been there several times. Gordon's Wine Bar, 19th century wine bar, candlelit, vaulted cellars. Oh, gee whiz, it's a great place. And finally, one more picture of this vaulted cellar. What a nice place to go and sample wine. And so that's basically it, folks. There we are.
Thanks so much, Ron, for that informative presentation. I certainly enjoyed it. We'll now start with the Q&A portion of the lecture, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Excellent. So I think the first question was, what has surprised you the most about the research you do? Obviously, it's quite broad. What specific or specifics have been most surprising to you as you've gone about compiling all of this?
Well, really, the glasses. I always thought that that kind of tulip-shaped glass, the ISO wine tasting glass, must have been around for a long time, and it wasn't. And even in the early part of the 20th century, they had these, what I would call water goblets, small volume. That's what people had. To me, when I'm tasting wine, I swirl my wine. I want to smell it. I want to see how it evolves and everything. How could I do that? I still can't do it with that type of glass. And I feel very sorry for people in the old days. And then another one was, I'd always assumed, that's what I'm used to. If I go for a fancy meal, I'll have a soup, and then have the salad, maybe at the beginning or the end. If it's really fancy, I might have fish, and then have some meat and dessert. Everything's a nice sequence. And that wasn't common before. That blew my mind. And just that, well, what I now consider common, I project it into the past. But when you look at the past, it wasn't that way. And that was the biggest shock.
I have another question that's come in that says, in the earlier slide about the right season, might evolution refer to the changes that happen when a wine ages and it peaks or is considered ideal?
Yeah, that's, I don't know why a person who knew so much about wine would talk about evolution. I would have expected to say as the wine ages. So it was the use of it. Yes, I suspect that's what he actually meant. It's just, I wish it'd be a little more explicit.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm just pulling up another question here, Ron, that's come in. It says, with all the variation on an individual level for taste and flavor detection, why don't we trust our own palate more rather than rely on experts?
Hear, hear. Absolutely. We are our own icon. It's our pleasure that we're interested in, not somebody else's pleasure. Yes, for them it may have been paradise. For me, ordinary. What may be paradise for me, and often I find that true with tastings, the wine I love and I'm swooning and oh my God, how wonderful this wine is. And other people say, you like that one? We are individuals and we should follow our own dictates.
Just one more question then, broadly speaking, I mean, you've talked about all of these trends, Ron. Are there any wines that you would consider to be sort of not a silver bullet per se, but broadly speaking, well received across many different variables? Obviously, you're dealing with a huge amount of variables. Is there a specific wine type that tends to work well with a lot of things? Okay,
for the majority of people that I meet, it's clear what they prefer. Okay, if it's, I could sum it up in what was called the international wine style, where a white wine is slightly fruity, a little slight hint of sweetness, not too particularly dry, minimal bitterness. Now that seems to make everybody happy, on those who don't like the red wines and prefer white. Red wines, again, the international, you want it to be dark in color, fresh flavor, red fruity character, not on the smooth side, not particularly bitter or astringent. Those seem to be what most people prefer, and will, assuming that you don't make a big mistake with what you're going to compare it with, will be ideal for the majority of people. And people say, oh, lovely, lovely, lovely.
That looks to be all of our questions for today. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Once again, I'd like to thank Ron Jackson for joining us today, and to everyone who joined us virtually. Today's lecture video will be posted shortly to our website at brocu.ca/covey, and you can also find more info about the lecture series as a whole on that website. Coming up next in the 2022 Covey Lecture Series will be Monday, April 11th, when Covey director and researcher Debbie Inglis speaks on enhancing the Sauvignon Blanc character in the Vidal table wines. We hope you can join us when we return next week. Have a great day.